Hello and welcome everyone. We are delighted to have you join us for today's webinar. My name is Danna Greenberg and I'm one of the Alumni Career Advisors here at Wellesley College's Career Education Office. I'm delighted today to be joined by my friend and Wellesley alumna, Danna Greenberg. Yes, you heard it correctly, Dana and Danna. Danna is the Walter H. Carpenter Professor of Organizational Behavior at Babson College and the co-author of a new book called Maternal Optimism, the subject of today's webinar. Danna, we are so thrilled to have you joining us today to share what you've learned with the Wellesley community.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
We are excited to have you. I'd also like to add that since 2 out of 3 of Danna's children are the same ages as my 2 college-age sons, we have had many a conversation on the soccer sidelines about work and parenting issues. So she's one of my favorite resources to talk to. So I'd love to start by asking Danna, what even compelled you to start the research for this book? What made it come to mind?
So my colleague Jamie Ladge and I have been doing research in this area for close to 15 years now. And as part of that research, we've also been doing some consulting and executive education with women. Mm-hmm. And we get asked a lot of times for resources, right? I want to read more, I want to learn more. Mm-hmm. What can you offer us? And there are a lot of really great books out there on this topic. But as we looked at what had been written, we found a couple of things were frustrating to us. The first of which was that most of the books that are written are about that very early point of pregnancy, negotiating pregnancy in the workplace, mm-hmm. negotiating a maternity leave, return to work. There's a new book out called Pump, Work, Repeat, I think is the title, right? All as if mm-hmm. the only decision point is at the very beginning of, do I return to work mm-hmm. in the capacity that I was in before I became a working mother? Mm-hmm. The second thing that frustrated us was there's a lot of books that tell us what to do. They tell you how to navigate maternity leave. They tell you how to be a working mother. There's books that tell us how to be a good working couple mm-hmm. even. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that was frustrating to us is there's really not a one-size-fits-all. And we knew from our own research that there are a lot of women who are out there doing this a lot of different ways. And so what we wanted to do was write a book that spoke to women about the many different ways that they can write their work-family story. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to do it in a way that helped women start to think about the optimism, that mm-hmm. there is a lot of opportunity in the story. There's a lot of frustration and bumps mm-hmm. along the way, but there's also a lot you should be happy and optimistic about. Mm-hmm. And how do we start to change how we even approach our mindset? So mm-hmm. we felt like we had something to say to the conversation.
Well, both really, I read a lot more when my children were babies and toddlers. And as they've grown older, I feel like I turn more to friends for advice, like teenagers, cars, jobs. How do you navigate all that? And I think my friends and community have been more of a resource than when they were little. So that's true. And I think both of those comments would be very comforting to people. Number one, that there are many ways to do this. And number two, that there isn't just one decision point along the way. And if you don't go back to work when your maternity leave ends, that isn't going to stay the same until your children go to college.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit more about what some of those decision points might be and what might impact them?
Sure. I think one of the things that you point out that's really important is about this point of, if you are at a point where you have a choice, right? Because mm-hmm. not everyone has a choice, mm-hmm. but if you have a choice point to make about going back to work in the very beginning, that's not the only time people make that choice point. Mm-hmm. And it's also not the only time people choose not to go back to work. Mm-hmm. We actually know 70% of women with children between 0 and 18 are working mm-hmm. in some capacity. And the number is higher mm-hmm. when your children are 6 to 18. So it's like 76% at that number, and under 6, it's 65, right? So we know there are a lot of women who may take some time off mm-hmm. and will return to work. Mm-hmm. There are lots of things that form what's right for one individual, mm-hmm. right? You talked about sort of the first question is often, do you have a partner or not, mm-hmm. right? How you do this when you're single is radically different than mm-hmm. how you do this if you have a partner. Mm-hmm. And if you have a partner, what does their work life mm-hmm. look like? You and I both have talked about this, right? Our partners were both at long-term marriages mm-hmm. and our partners' careers have looked really different at different points, Absolutely. As have ours. And so there's an ebb and flow to the choices mm-hmm. that you're making that aren't always entirely about what do I want for my career, mm-hmm. but they're also as much about what does my partner want from their career at this point? And that may lead to some kinds of shifts. One of the biggest things we've seen from our research is family background and culture. Lots of people do this really differently depending on their own personal background. Did their mothers work? What were the expectations set for them around working, around careers? What's the expectations in the family around support? So, for example, we've interviewed a lot of women who come from different cultural backgrounds, China particularly, or India, where often the in-laws or the parents, the grandparents, will come and spend the first year with the young family.
Whoa.
Right?
A year's a long
time. I have a colleague at Babson. His mother moved in with him and his wife into a 900 square foot apartment in Brookline for a year, right? But that enabled them to make different kinds of choices than if they didn't have that support at home.
Well, so that's an important point. The choices along the way are not always about working or not working, because some people wouldn't choose that or can't choose that, but also about what kind of work, remote work, help or no help, family support or no family support. So there are just many choices that play into it. And it's interesting that family background plays a large role in it. I'm very proud of my grandmother, who was a working mom, but my own mom was not a working mom. So it's interesting, 2 generations ago, she was a head nurse. So anyway, all right. So multiple decision points along the way. And that really, I think, should take a lot of pressure off of people, because if your family situation, you and your partner and your jobs is working when the children are babies, then great. But if it stops working when all of a sudden the children become school-age children, that's okay, right? One pattern, one solution, one family situation is not meant to last until they go to college.
We only wish it would, right? We make everything, we get everything, we figure that out, and then we think it's good, and we really want it to remain the same. And that's one of the things we really wanted with this book, was to help people start to understand this longer term perspective on work and family. You are not just a working parent when your child is 0 to 5. And there's something about, we've done a great job in organizations and even in society, right? We're talking a lot more today about the issues of return to work, very early child care, how are we supporting women, maternity leave, as if they stop or go away as children age, right? And for most women, the next dramatic is that school age, as you said, right? Your child hits 5, and there's this question of, you've been waiting this whole time, oh my gosh, they're finally going to go to school. And you and I both know what happens when they go to elementary school, right? All of a sudden,
they get sick.
They get sick, right? The alignment that you get, usually you're able to create, if you're lucky enough to find high quality childcare that works for you, that you can afford, that works along with your work schedule. You figure out a way to make a match. And when they go to elementary school, that match is gone, right? The school day doesn't line up. There's before school care, there's after school care you need. There's, I think it's 29 days during the school year where kids are out of school. And then there's summer vacation. So that can be a new stress and transition point. And that's means that you may need to switch things up or change things up, right? And then we know that even if you're in a community, 50% of our communities have high quality after school care programs. Kids go to middle school. Right. Middle school is all about social and emotional development, an age group I never want to have to work with ever again. Right. But often that's when they don't want to go to that after school care, because maybe their friends aren't going to after school care, or they get passionate about an activity and that expectation. So kids' lives are changing, families' lives are changing, and our work and our career choices change with that.
Right. That's a lot of change to go along in parallel, I think, the career changes with the family changes. It reminds me of an article that I read where they suggested that for teenagers wish for their parents to be potted plants in the background, not saying much, but there. And that could affect work, family decisions, because maybe when your children are teenagers, you could do work from home because you will be there, but you won't say much. And that might not have been something you considered when your children were in elementary school or something like that. So you talked a lot about, the children grow and there are different stages, middle school, high school, even off to college. what about the unexpected changes come up? I feel that a lot of Wellesley alums will reach out to our office when something unexpected happens, like job loss or divorce, or they have been out for a while and they have just no idea how to get back into the workforce. So those real questions or life transition points, or I guess I'm combining two things here, unexpected changes. How do people deal with that? It also might be caring for a grandparent in the family. That can be a very unexpected change.
Absolutely. And that's the other part of the book that we really talk about, is these things that we would call the unexpected, the unplanned changes, the things that you just can't prepare for, right? And one of the things you really have to do is take those as opportunities to stop and ask yourself, what's going to work for me at this very moment in time? One of the things we really try to remind women is that none of these are permanent decisions, right? So if you're in a situation, for example, I was working with a group last week, and a woman whose child had very significant special needs, and they were able to make preschool and daycare work. But as the child transitioned to a public elementary school, she found she needed to be home, and she ended up switching jobs to find something that was infinitely more flexible. And in her mind, this is what I need to do now, but in 10 years or 5 years, it's going to look really differently. So reminding yourself the decision point or choice or the negotiation you need to make at this point isn't a permanent decision.
I think it's also helpful for people not to beat themselves up for not having foreseen something. There are things that you will not be able to foresee, the health challenges, or a phase that your child is going through where they just really need more support. And so as hard as it is, I think sometimes to react to those things, that is part of life. And, maybe even reaching out to others who've been through similar things can be really helpful in that moment.
Absolutely. I think we have really high expectations for ourselves, right? And particularly Wellesley alums have very high expectations for themselves. And so we start to create a system, and it's working. And we just have to recognize that that is what life is. It's about change. And we need to adjust and shift our work-family situations to change along with it.
Okay. Well, one thing I know that we share is a great interest in positive psychology. So I would love to, you mentioned at the beginning that you were focusing on the positive aspects of work and parenthood. And I think that a lot of times in the press, people talk about the tough days and the tough parts. But in your book, you did notice that there were benefits both for your working life and for your parenting life. So I would love to have people hear about those and feel really good about that. So at work, what is one thing that is really supported and encouraged and enhanced by being a working parent?
One thing. You want one thing?
Well, let's start with
this.
That.
This is actually one of my favorite things to talk about, right? We've done quite a bit of research, both Jamie and I together and independently, asking women these very questions. What in that return to work process in the very beginning or in the first 5 to 6 years, how do you think you've changed at work as a result of becoming a parent? And the findings are really unexpected, and it's shocking to me that we're not talking more about them. So one of the most basic things women talk about is they develop a lot more empathy, and they find themselves being better at working with their colleagues, right? Because they talk about, I have more patience all of a sudden, I listen more. Your point before about things being unexpected and being able to respond and react in ways that are appropriate to that unexpected, that becomes a big part of a change for them. Women talk also about networking. That networking actually changes for them. All of a sudden, being a working parent means they connect with people, as people have said to us, there's a club. And all of a sudden, I'm part of a club that I didn't even know existed. And I have access and relationships to people that I might not have had before I had a child. One of the most interesting things is women talk about being better managers. In a number of ways. One of the things we talk about, this idea of when you're a working mother, you're time starved all the time, right? We're always worried about, I don't have enough time to put into work. I don't have enough time to put into family. But that actually can make women be better managers. So women talk about, now that I have a time deadline, I don't micromanage my team as much. I don't have time to micromanage. Or they talk about, I empower my team more and give them strategic opportunities, because some of that work that might have come on my plate before that I would take and be excited to do, I don't have time to do. So I'm going to give that off to my team members and let them develop those skills as well.
So that sounds like a win-win for the manager and the team, because the team is having growth opportunities that they might not have had with someone who was a little more controlling, shall we say.
Absolutely.
I love the empathy one too, because not only are you more empathetic with the individual that you're working with or that is on your team, you're empathetic with them as a parent too, because you've been through that perhaps if you're a little bit older maybe, or your children are older. So it's like a two-sided thing where you really have double empathy there.
Exactly, of empathy for people's life situations, but empathy for who they are, and a recognition that not everybody's going to work the same way you do, right? Because when you parent, not every child works the way that you expect them to work, and they don't work the way each one works, right? So you have to start to learn to adjust the same skills you need as a manager working with a team.
Right. Every child you have will surprise you, because they don't act like their brothers and sisters, and we should apply that as with our colleagues as well, for sure.
Absolutely. The other thing that I think is really interesting, their point is creativity and innovation. One of the things, again, to this issue of time blocking is that when women are blocked on their time, they're forced to go off and do other things. And one of the things we hear, particularly from women scientists, is by having that time block and having to leave the lab and take a break and think about other things, they come back refreshed with new ideas, new insights, new creativity. And so one of the things to think about is, how is being a parent opening you up to new perspective, new ideas that can help you be more innovative at work?
Wow, I love that. Who knew? Who knew? And creativity is a part of it too. That's great. I also really like to hear more about just the sense of perspective. There are many women, many Wellesley alums have grown up and succeeded because they are, close to perfectionists, if not. And sometimes when we have children, they teach us that, it isn't going to be perfect. And I have a friend who works in the television news business, and she noted that some of her colleagues thought that something was an emergency when they were filming something. And she said, didn't really feel like as much of an emergency as having 4 hungry children in the grocery store. So just that kind of perspective taking, and I guess dialing down the perfectionism. Did you find some of that also?
We absolutely did find some of that. And I think that's, again, something like when we talk about the Wellesley population, right? That often is a trait or something we see with the Wellesley population. And again, that's that idea of being time crunched a little bit. All of a sudden, good is really good enough, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. And so how do you figure out when something is good enough? Sometimes it's simply because you just don't have the time to do it. And I think that one of the things we talk about in the book also is that good enough is important to be at work, but also at home, right? One of the things going on in our world today is all the pressures around intensive mothering and ideal mothering, and what does it mean to be perfect as a mother and at home, right? And good is good enough there too. And so when do we start to allow ourselves to be comfortable in that good enough?
I like that you acknowledge that sometimes the decision about good enough isn't even our decision. It's a decision that's made for us because we've run out of time, or we only had so many hours of sleep last night because someone was sick, and we're doing the best we can. I think we need to, sometimes I think moms need to pat themselves on the back and just say, you are doing the best you can.
You're doing the best you can, and not to have such expectations. So I know for myself, a friend of mine, when our kids were younger, came up, she had read an article about something called crappy dinners, which we talk about in the book. And the idea behind a crappy dinner was, during the week, you get together with a friend, maybe another working parent, and you just eat whatever's in the house, right? There's you don't clean up your house, you don't clean up your kids, you don't shop, whatever you can take out, if it's a box of spaghetti, and the point is just to be together and to form those relationships with people, and not to hold ourselves to some of the real simple or other expectations we see, or Pinterest or other kinds of things of the perfect working family.
That's a great example of good enough. And, no one ever really had a problem if they had pizza too many nights in a row, right?
No, not at all.
So what about, let's see, shifting to the home front, what are the positive effects of your career on your children? And does it differ if they're boys or girls?
That's a great question. So Kathleen McGinn, who's over at Harvard, has done some really exciting new research looking at the career and life choices that people are making, men and women, if they're had working mothers at home. And by defining somebody as a working mother, it doesn't mean that they had to be working full-time in sort of a lean-in type situation, just that they had a working mother at home. And one of the things that she's been able to see is that she's been able to see the impact on young women in their careers if they had a working mother. They tend to pursue more managerial opportunities. They tend to gain more stretch assignments at work, and their salary and compensation is higher.
So they've had a lot, that study was had enough longevity to follow these women into their actual career.
Yeah, so it's followed them over a number of years in their early career stages, and she's actually taken that data and they've looked at it cross-culturally and seen these patterns in Mexico as well.
Oh, that's
so
great.
It's really interesting to see. And then on the young men front, one of the things they're seeing is that young men are more engaged co-partners at home. And that they're more likely to pick up more responsibilities, to be a more active co-parent, take on more household chores, those kinds of things. So that when we talk about that second shift and the added labor that often falls on women, young men are often better co-parents when they've had a working mom because they've seen different models at home.
Right. And maybe they've even seen that model change throughout the years. So, wow, that's great. All right, I'd like to invite anyone to put a question into the chat if you have any. We're going to chat. We're going to talk a little bit more, but we'd love to have you ask some questions, and Danna can respond in a couple of minutes. But one thing I would like to, well, actually, before I ask that question, are there any other of the positive benefits we haven't covered? I think we've covered the empathy and the creativity. The perspective. Anything else come out of that we haven't covered, or have we gone over most of them?
One of the other positives that we kind of haven't talked about is really sort of the opportunity to expand your network. We talked a little bit about that, but one of the things that working mothers often talk about is that they get access to people at a lot of different levels because they're a working mother. I've also seen working mothers take it as an opportunity to show their leadership, right? So they might be in an organization and they're not seeing a lot of support for working parents, and they'll use that as an opportunity to create those networks, create those relationships, and show their own leadership. So it can be a place also that if you're missing, a lot of times people come to me and be like, my organization doesn't have, and the question is, well, what can you do to create that? And it can be a way that you can show leadership internally in an organization to create those systems in place.
That's a fantastic idea, because I do feel that also some people will say, I have to run home. I mean, I don't have time for networking. I'm working on taking care of my family. When does that fit in? So how can they even fit that into they're already time-starved day?
Right. But I think it goes back to sort of even our conversations when we were talking about like sort of on the soccer field, right? We think sometimes networking has to be this formal, I'm going out to an event at night. It's a professional event, it's an alumni event. But networking also happens through your day-to-day interactions, right? So if you're, in our case, right, the soccer field, we learned about what one another did, right? Because we spent all those years on the soccer sides, right? And you can do the same thing at drop off and pickup. You're building relationships with other people in your community, which can have important career implications for you.
I'm often encouraging Wellesley alums that come talk to me who have young children. You're probably used to talking to your friends about, how they like this teacher, or where is there a new activity for children interested in music, but don't forget to ask them, what work did they do before? Do they work now? Or are they hoping to do something? Because I think sometimes we get focused on the commonalities of the conversations around the children, and we forget to talk about our own professional interests.
Absolutely. And then I think remembering that most people are going to be, if they're taking time off from work, they're going to go back to work.
Right.
And there are lots of things, if you're a working parent, you can offer a parent who's currently home to help them think about those things. So that reciprocity. That
reciprocity is key. I had two friends, which this was very interesting. They both had careers. They were both taking a short time off, and they wanted to basically switch with each other. So I connected them because they, one liked the other one's prior career, but they almost wanted to trade places. So that was very good.
That's great.
Well, Danna, you know that Wellesley women think of themselves as fiercely independent, very capable, very resourceful, and they are. But also, you know, too much of that actually could be a little bit dangerous in thinking, you know, I have to shoulder all of this all by myself. And the Wellesley community is so strong. Do you have suggestions for how families, you know, women and their partners, or, you know, moms and dads, whatever, could really, how should they think about community?
It's a great question. And it's great to start with this idea that the Wellesley community is so strong, right? It's a strong community because it's a collection of individuals coming together who support each other. So I was telling you, I got a call the other day from a young Wellesley alum saying, I'm interested in your career. Could you talk? And I always take those calls because I want to support them. It's only in the past 50 to 60 years, since the 50s, that we think it's the nuclear family's responsibility to raise healthy children, to be healthy adults. Prior to that, it was something we did in community, whether we did it in a faith-based community, in a geographic community, or we did it in our own sort of extended family community. And we really relied on each other. And as lives and careers have changed and geographic mobility has changed, we've seen fragmentation in that community. And that's one of the things that really causes stress. So the question I really encourage women to think about is, how do you put community back in to the work family situation? And there are lots of really creative ways you can do that. I actually was just working with an organization, and they actually use geocaching to identify where all of the people in their organization live. You can opt into the system, and then you can reach out to other people who live in your same area to ask them questions about, how did you manage after school care in middle school? Or do you have a great babysitter? Or have you done research on daycare facilities? Or I'm stuck going home, could you pick up my child, right? So that they're using that as a way to create community out of the workplace. Similarly, we have to think about how to do it at home. How do we rely and leverage and use each other to build one another up? Because that reciprocity, as we said before, always comes back to help.
That's a theme that keeps reverberating. I recently read about a community where there happened to be a lot of people who didn't work 9 to 5. They were nurses, or they were police officers, or other kinds of shift work, or people who often had to work on a weekend. And there are many of those. And this community really came together around that and helped each other with childcare because their schedules were erratic in a sense. And I really enjoyed reading about that.
That's great. Or what you can lobby your town for, right? I was working with a woman last week, and she told me that one of the things she did was got herself elected to school committee so that they would stop closing schools half day for snow days. So the rule was you had to make the decision the night before or the morning of. You couldn't halfway through the school day say we're closing, right? And we know what that does for our working family.
Sure. I'm from Rochester, New York. I had that situation a few times. All right. Well, I think we'll turn to some questions now. We have one great question here. What could you say about the need for a lead parent? Is that something that you think is important? How do you advise navigating the shifts with a partner in work-family demands and that concept of a lead parent?
The concept of a lead parent. I don't want to say it's important to have a lead parent because, again, I think this goes back to that question of every couple is going to navigate this differently, right? I think what I would recommend is it's really important to have conversations with your partner about what you want to do. And what you want to do is wrapped up in really sort of two questions. One is, what do your jobs look like? What do they look like in terms of your commute, in terms of your flexibility? And what are your own desires and ambitions around being a parent? Right? And what is important for you? So for example, I really liked parenting young children. And I certainly would argue that I was the lead primary parent when our kids were little. My husband's really good with them as adolescents, much better than I am, right? And so he has taken the leadership role then. So one of the things that's really important is to be just having active conversations about what is it that we need to do to be a household, right? And that has everything to do with the physicality of taking care of children, to the emotional labor of taking care of children, to the household management. Right? And people can take leads on different aspects of that.
I've heard you talk about that before, and I really admire the fact that you and your husband were both very honest about which parts you loved and that you shifted being the lead parent. So in other words, it doesn't always have to be one person.
It doesn't.
All right. How do you recommend that people seek options that might be more flexible for parents who need that at a certain point in their careers?
It's a great question. I've done a lot of research on this topic. I love the question of negotiating flexibility. There are a couple of things that I always start with on this conversation. The first of which is that flexibility should be standard in our workplace at this point, right? And so when you're asking around flexible work arrangements, it's not asking necessarily for something non-traditional. Right? Flexibility, depending on what you want, is something we should all be able to do. Now, some jobs aren't set up for it, right? So the first thing you have to figure out is, what is my job? And what kind of flexibility can I have on my job? Is it flexibility of location, right? You were saying before, doing some work from home in the afternoons. Is it a flexibility of a compressed work week, working 4 days a week instead of 5? Is it a flexibility in terms of time, right? Maybe I want a later start or an earlier start. And then going in and talking to your manager about that. It's really important to know what is officially your policies, but in most organizations, there's a lot of unofficial policy. And if you've been a solid performer and been doing well in your organization and contributing, you should be very comfortable going into your manager and talking a little bit about what you might want to shift right now and why you might want to make it shift, right? If you've got a manager who's really hesitant to do this, sometimes I encourage people to think about doing it as a pilot or a test,
trial
right?
Run.
A trial run. Let's do this for 6 weeks. You're not guaranteeing you're going to let me continue to do it. And let's sit down in 6 weeks and see how we can make this even better, or see if this is working for the organization. And I think coming in with this question of what works for me and my family, but what's working for my organization. And if you look at it from both perspectives, managers can be a lot more open around flexibility.
How do people learn about the more hidden parts of it, or the unspoken flexibility? Is it really just by watching other people or talking to people that you think have more flexibility? How do they find out what the realm of acceptability might be?
One of the things that's really important is to start to build relationships in your organization and have people you can talk to and have some of these confidential conversations with. Often that's part of the information gathering phase before you go down and talk to your manager about flexibility, is looking around the organization. If there's somebody in another division, if you're in a big company who seems to be doing something that's more flexible, go have lunch with them or coffee and say to them, like, I'm really interested in how you made this work and how you talk to your manager. What are the challenges? If you have a confidant in your own group, right? Maybe there's nobody who's doing a flexible arrangement in your group, but you have someone you really trust, and you can go and say, hey, look, I'm interested in doing this. What do you think I need to worry about or think about as I think about how do I approach our manager about making this change, right?
Great suggestion.
And I think the only other thing I'd say is that in terms of flexibility, sometimes we assume women managers are going to be more generous or easygoing around that than male managers, and that's not always the case. So don't make an assumption based upon the gender of your manager that they are more or less open to flexible arrangements, because again, every story is different and you don't know what their work-life story is.
Right. They may have had more challenges than you know, or fewer challenges than you know, that may have impacted their ability to think flexibly. What about just the whole idea of if you feel like you're really a trailblazer or a groundbreaker in your company for this, what can help them with the courage, with the support to propose something? Maybe they don't see that anyone else has proposed anything like that.
Yeah, the trailblazers, it's always the hardest being a trailblazer. One of the things to do is you really, just like the one thing to do about a flexibility, and it's true of leave also, it really is a negotiation. Right? This isn't just you coming in and demanding flexibility. And it's not necessarily a manager saying absolutely no, right? A hard no, maybe they need to be learning and trained about what flexible work is and how it might benefit them. So doing your research is really important in advance. And sometimes having data about your industry there, you can Google and look at a lot of sites about what's going on in different industries around flexibility. What are some of the most creative practices? One of the things we know about flexibility is it helps tremendously with retention. It actually helps flexibility, helps with productivity. So gathering some of that data and building the case for flexibility in the organization may be really important.
Great idea to go to outside resources. All right. Another question, has your research delved into the economic factors related to one person or the other taking a break to be a full-time parent for a short time or a long time, impacting women for the rest of for later in their career?
I haven't done the economic research, but I know the economic research, so I can certainly share that with you. One of the things that we know is, let's just even start with before we get to the time off question, is that having children has a negative consequence on women's wages. And actually, we know the more children you have, the negative impact increases.
Really?
So there's a negative, women take a wage hit from the first child to the second child. They take a wage hit from the second child to the third child. So that's an important thing to be aware of, right? We do also know that the implications of time off for either partner, and I'm going to get to this in another part of this question in a minute, is pretty significant, right? And you can actually, there are some websites, and we reference them in the book, where you can actually put in how many years you're thinking about taking off, what industry you're in, to look at what the economic impact is. Wow. Because it goes beyond wages to everything from what is the aggregate of raises over time, or 401k matching programs not vesting, and those kinds of things. And so when I'm talking to women and they're at that choice point of returning to work or not, and if it's purely for them an economic question, right? And sometimes people say, well, my childcare is so expensive that the incremental money I'm bringing home doesn't seem worth it to me, right? Well, the first question is, do they want to return to work? And if they do, they need to look at it beyond that incremental year or 2 years or 3 years or 5 years of childcare, right? Which is that if you're staying in the workforce for those 5 years, that has significant financial positive repercussions for you and your partner.
So again, the long view, we're hearing a lot of that. You can't, I mean, you have to think about what's going to work for the short term, but also know that things will change over the long term. And sometimes you have to really factor that in.
Yeah. I mean, there's a woman, Kate Wadsworth, down at UNC, who just won a Rosebeth Moss Cantor Award for her work. She's actually now done work looking at resumes of people who stayed at home. To see what impact, if there was a career gap, and it specifically said took time off to be home with children. And she did find that there seems to be some stigmatization about staying at home, and women seem to pay a price for that more than men. So the research isn't great there. And then on the other hand, you work a lot with return to workers, and I've worked with them too. And I think there's a lot you can do in your home that sets you up really well for returning to work.
Right. It's what we like to call strategic volunteering.
Exactly.
Or doing a project or a gig or something like that. And that's where networking comes in too, because it may be a fellow Wellesley alumna who passes your resume to somebody and says, you know, she's taken some time off to raise her kids, but she's really sharp and great, and I think we should bring her in for a conversation. And that's sometimes all you need.
Exactly.
All right. Any tips for overcoming the working mom stigma in a workplace culture? I'm finding it tougher to propel my career forward since becoming a mother. Also struggling to feel confident enough to take advantage of more flexible hours due to the optics of being in a leadership role in a workplace where direct reports have less flexibility.
Ooh, there are a lot of points in there. I'm not even sure where to start. Let's start with the workplace piece. Yeah. I think that's sort of, because that's where the question starts. Yes. And I think that's workplaces are changing, but nowhere near as rapidly and as significantly as we would like to see. And in today's culture of what we call extreme jobs, right? Jobs that require not just a lot of time, but also a lot of emotional capacity, and also jobs that are requiring sort of a lot of chaos, right? Time interruptions, continually changing priorities. Those are the places we see women struggling the most about being comfortable and confident about who they are as working mothers. One of the recommendations, one of the ways that can be really helpful here is looking for mentors. looking for people in the organization you can vicariously learn from, right? Who are maybe some other women in the organization who seem to be managing this in a way that is something that looks successful to you, and talking to them and finding out, what can you learn from them. If you've got people who are senior working fathers who have wives who work full-time, talk to them also. Because they're managing a very different kind of work-family structure than if they had a stay-at-home partner. And you can be surprised to find really strong allies in there. The other thing, one of the things we talk about when we talk about networking is we talk about the importance of mentoring, but sponsors are really important too. And so looking in your organization is there someone in your organization who isn't judging you, isn't treating you differently, and you can rely on for some sponsorship, and ask them to help sponsor you and help other people realize how committed, engaged you are at work as a working mother.
I always like to remind people to think about creating a personal board of directors. And that people can't always find one mentor who kind of matches with every question they have. That seems unrealistic. So maybe you have someone who's just a little bit kind of ahead of you at work, or has risen up a little bit, and then somebody who's very far, a very senior leader who you look towards for more global inspiration. And maybe it's a neighbor whose children are 5 years older than yours, because she has still a good memory, or he or she has a good memory of what she's just been through. So putting together that group of people, I think, can be really helpful. And it doesn't have to be just one person. I think sometimes people get that misconception.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well, Danna, this has been so helpful. I really appreciate your coming to share with your fellow alums what you have learned. We are going to send out a link to this webinar, and we are going to send out some additional resources with information about the Maternal Optimism book if you would like to purchase it. I would also like to encourage you to make an appointment with me or my colleague Becky King if you wish to talk about more of these issues and your own work-life integration challenges. But for today, I just want to thank you for sharing your insights. This has been really fun.
Thank you. It's been great. Thank you. There were great questions. So thanks for the conversation, everyone.
All right, everyone. Thank you for joining.